Welcome to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and my guest today is Don Rusnak, the Member of Parliament for Thunder Bay, Rainy River. Don, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Steve. Pleasure to be here again.
And it's welcome back, really.
Yeah, welcome back. Yeah. Third time, I believe.
So, you've now been a member for 2 years.
And a little bit.
And a little bit. So, what have you learned in 2 years serving as our member in Ottawa?
As I had done with all previous careers, that relationships are absolutely important to everything you're doing, and especially in this line of work. I think the relationships that I have with the municipal leaders and stakeholders right across the riding have been instrumental in shaping the kind of member of parliament I've become. I don't want to toot my own horn, but I think I have a lot of respect within our caucus. Our caucus did, our Indigenous caucus did select me as the first ever chair, and it was something that I created in terms of the Indigenous caucus. The relationships that I have with members of cabinet and other members in our caucus is very important to the work I'm doing, and has helped me along in a lot of what I've done as the Member of Parliament for the last 2 years and a bit.
So are you still chair of the Indigenous Caucus?
I'm not. So on September of last year, I received a call from the Prime Minister, and he asked me to take on some additional responsibilities. That responsibility was coincided with the Prime Minister dividing up INAC, and really out of the ashes of INAC creating two new ministries. One
INAC is the
Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada, and so out of the ashes of Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada, creating two new ministries with two ministers, one being the Department of Indigenous Services Canada and Crown Indigenous Relations. So one of those ministries headed by Minister Philpott, who was the former Minister of Health, and the former Minister of INAC, Carolyn Bennett, leading CERNA. So, and I was asked to be the Parliamentary Secretary to Minister Philpott in Indigenous Services.
So sometimes when people get an appointment like that, there can be two reasons. One is they've been in trouble where they are and you want to get them out. The other is that they've really shown they're able to achieve the goals they had and are wanting, to continue with that. What were those goals that the Indigenous Caucus had? And how did you guys do at that stage?
Well, I think it was part and parcel in forming the Indigenous Caucus in the first place. We had the most number of Indigenous MPs ever elected to Parliament, and the most ever within our caucus.
How many was that?
We have 9 Indigenous MPs in the Liberal Indigenous Caucus. Okay. There's also 2 other members that are members of the NDP caucus, Georgina Jolibois and Romeo Saganash, and we deal closely with them. Romeo and Georgina have both become friends of mine, and I seek their counsel. Again, going back to the relationships that we want to hear. I certainly want to hear all voices, especially people that have a keen understanding of the problems in the Indigenous community and have solutions to solving those problems.
So, coming back to what were those goals of the Indigenous Caucus? Did you guys establish some goals or priorities that you wanted to work on?
Well, to start off with, it was reaching out to other members of caucus, and we have a very diverse caucus from members in densely populated urban areas like Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, to members from rural areas on the East Coast, rural isolated northern areas like the Northwest Territories, the Yukon, making sure that we were hearing those voices from Indigenous communities right across the country. One of the things that I understood well, that there can't be a pan-Indigenous approach to any solution for Indigenous issues across this country. Some are regional, some are cultural, some are some are very micro-regional. I often, people who don't understand the Indigenous community in Canada, and sometimes a lot of Canadians don't understand Indigenous communities in this country.
Me included.
Well, comparing it to Europe, and Europe has very distinct cultural language groups. It would be like treating people in southern Spain the same as people in northern Denmark. Of course, different languages, different cultures, oftentimes different beliefs. To have programs or plans for diverse groups of people doesn't work. So you have to include the individual in the decision-making process for decisions that affect them. And that's been the goal of the Indigenous Caucus, to make sure that those voices are heard right across the country, are brought to the federal government, and we're really engaging in a process of self-determination. But those voices are different from east to west to north.
So what's your role as parliamentary secretary then for the Indigenous Services branch or ministry?
When the Prime Minister called me to take on this role as parliamentary secretary, I of course accepted. When the Prime Minister calls you, often smart idea to accept. And I stepped down as the Indigenous Caucus chair and handed it over to the Indigenous Caucus to make a decision. They made the decision that Dan Vandel, who's the member for St. Boniface, Métis from Manitoba, to lead the Indigenous Caucus. And I pretty much immediately met with the Minister Philpott, someone who I have a great respect for, someone that I traveled to along with the Member of Parliament for Kenora, Bob Nault, last summer up to Wanneman Lake, and in her role as Health Minister, and Abomatung First Nation, to see some of the things that the communities were doing. So her and I had discussions about where the ministry should go, how it should, I don't want to say reconstituted, but how we should raise this new ministry up from the ashes. So I'm there in a supporting role, an advisory role. The most, I think, visible responsibility in terms of parliamentary function is I replace her in the House of Commons when she's not there. During question period, I answer questions, but really a supportive role. I've, in my capacity as the parliamentary secretary, I've traveled to the East Coast in Nova Scotia, meeting with First Nations there, and hearing their concerns, and announcing some projects. I spoke at the Indigenous Bar Association in Halifax, their annual conference. Did an announcement in Winnipeg not so long ago, and spoke with members at a CFS conference.
We're going to need to hold right there. We're going to have to take a short break, but come right back, because we're going to find out more about our federal government. Welcome back to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and my guest today is Don Rusnak, the Member of Parliament for Thunder Bay Rainy River and the Parliamentary Secretary to the Ministry of Indigenous Services.
Correct.
Did I get that right?
That is.
Oh, all right. So you talked about, in a way, the government and the ministry want to provide more power or control to local communities, Indigenous communities, to be able to kind of chart their course forward. How do you do that? And what are the challenges in moving in that direction? I know in terms of big bureaucracies, there is this idea that everything has to be the same.
Yeah.
In order, like they would think consistency is fairness. But what you've pointed out is that's not always the case. That if we don't look at the individual needs in a community or with people, that consistency may not actually result in where we want to go. So how do we do that? How do we engage folks in their own land, in their own community, and be able to administer that on a big federal level?
Well, let's step back for a moment and talk again about Indigenous Services and CERNA, DISC and CERNA, the acronyms. So Indigenous Services and Crown Indigenous Relations.
Okay.
Indigenous Services is really what's been going on with INAC for it's service delivery. So providing health, housing, water, your infrastructure needs in the First Nation communities. Education. So Indigenous Services does the kind of the bread and butter of the communities right now. There's some communities that are in their own governance agreements, their own self-determination agreements. So there's communities that are really are so dependent on the Indian Act and getting services from the federal government. And I think you can agree, and I think most of your viewers would agree, that that's not a healthy way or a successful way to run a community. When, if, for example, think of the city of Thunder Bay, decisions were being made in Ottawa for what's good for the community. I think all of us here in the region would say that no, that's not the way government should operate. Government
That's why we love to hate Toronto.
I won't say my Toronto colleagues may be a little bit, but we want to make sure that one, we're providing good services. So there's a lot of communities that are really dependent on the Indian Act and the services that INAC has provided. So we want to make sure that one, we're getting those services right for right now. But what we want to see, and what I think all of Canada wants to see, and what First Nation communities and Indigenous people across this country want to see, is those decisions start to be made by themselves, for themselves. Far too often we've seen decisions made in Ottawa for communities like Attawapiskat, communities like Fort Hope, communities like Lac LaCroix or Couchiching or Fort William First Nation, made in Ottawa that don't work for the communities here locally. So our job is to build that capacity and provide good services at the Indigenous Services level, but get that capacity up to a level to where the community now can be a part and parcel of planning their own future, and that's where CERNA comes in.
So now this is building capacity in the First Nation,
in the
or
First
within
Nations.
the bureaucracy of the federal government?
It's a little bit of both, because I think it's a new way of it's for some people it's a new way of thinking that First Nations are going to be controlling their own destiny and planning their own future, and not constantly being going to the government hat in hand for solutions. And building that capacity up is going to make the community stronger, ultimately at their own speed, and if they want to participate. It's not the government forcing communities to go down this path. It's naturally where I personally think, and I think a lot of people would agree with me, that where most communities would want to go, where they'd want to make the decisions that affect their community going forward within their community, not having someone else make the decision for them. So that's what CERN is about. CERN is about, we just had the Anishinaabeg Education Agreement, where the largest agreement of its kind in Canada. There's been a Mi'kmaq education agreement where the Mi'kmaq are in control of their own education system on the East Coast. The outcomes from students in that system are higher than the provincial system in Nova Scotia. So it just shows you that making the decisions for your own communities at the community level, you get way better outcomes, and we hope to see that with the Anishinaabeg Education Agreement, but in everything, in infrastructure, education, health, having the communities having the decision-making power to make those decisions and plan for the long term is going to be better for the communities, and overall better for all of Canada and all of our people in the country.
So you know, education is one of the areas I'm particularly interested in, because it seems to me that sets the foundation for the future for all our services and activities. And the funding for First Nations education on reserve has been fallen 30-40% below what our provincial funding is per student. So it's one thing to say, okay, now you get control, but what about the dollars? Are those dollars being addressed by the federal government?
Yeah, so part and parcel of the agreements is making sure that the funding is adequate for, not adequate, but it meets or exceeds the provincial standards. That I guess I'll say we start with the premise that all Canadians are equal and they should have an equal amount of funding for whatever it may be, whether it be healthcare, whether it be education, that we need. That's what the role of the federal government is, to make sure that we have same level of service in various parts of the country. We don't have it perfect right now. We know that. We know we have, in some aspects, we have less service in First Nation communities, or we have less service in northern isolated communities than we do in, say, more densely populated areas. But we have to get better. We have to make sure that that service level as Canadians remains consistent across the country. How we get there is making sure that we have local control, but we also have systems in terms of financing and funding that account for regional differences and the differences that we see right across the country.
So where are we at now in Ontario, in our region, for funding for First Nation students? How does that rank according to what the province pays?
Yeah, I don't have the numbers, but I'll confidently say that we're less in terms of funding First Nation children in on reserve. We can get the numbers to you, and I know with the Anishinaabeg Education Agreement, I know some of the details are still being worked out, but ultimately what we want to see is that consistent standard of education in terms of whether you're on reserve or off reserve or in a non First Nation setting, to make sure that those students are getting the same education no matter where they are. And having that local control is part and parcel of it.
Don, we're going to take another break. I just want to talk to you all afternoon here. This is great. Please stay with us and we'll wrap up on Indigenous issues and touch on a few more. Welcome back to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and my guest is Don Rusnak, the Member of Parliament for Thunder Bay Rainy River. So Don, the last little bit here, I want to touch again on Indigenous issues, and last week the Prime Minister talked about we're going to create a new legal framework for Indigenous rights. The question that goes around in my head over and over is reconciliation. And how do we do that, and what do we do? I mean, what do I do? You know, as an individual, but also as a citizen and a taxpayer. How do you frame that for yourself? Like what advice can you give me, and what are the steps you're taking?
I think for most people, I would say educate yourself and build relationships. Talk with people in First Nation communities. Talk with Indigenous people that maybe you wouldn't normally talk to. Go to a cultural event. Go to a powwow. Go and learn about the culture. Educate yourself. Some of the stuff in terms of what our government's doing in terms of the announcement last week by the Prime Minister is high level. It's operationalizing Section 35, and I can get into the legal speak about it. The funny story is I was a student at the British Columbia Treaty Commission as part of the program I took at Osgoode, the intensive program in Aboriginal Resource Laws and Government at the BC Treaty Commission, when our now Justice Minister and Attorney General, Jody Wilson-Raybould, who was just Jody Wilson at the time, was the advisor that I worked with and I was assigned with at the BC Treaty Commission. So her father, if you don't know, worked with the previous Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau and the wrangling over the Constitution, and one of the individuals credited with having Section 35 entrenched into the Constitution. But for years, decades, there's been that discussion on what does Section 35 mean. I think it's fitting that our now Justice Minister is working with the current Prime Minister and other Trudeau in operationalizing that and making it make sense and adding some permanence to it, because we have self-determination agreements and government agreements with Indigenous communities across this country, but they don't fit with either federal laws or provincial laws or territorial laws. So having a framework, and the Justice Minister used the term setting the stage to make sure when we have an Anishinaabeg education agreement, it plugs into a federal framework. It's plug and play, so to speak, that communities aren't just on the outside as many feel they are now. They have an agreement, but they have no funds to implement, or they have no connection with the federal government. So making sure we set the stage, everyone knows how it operates, and we have that federal framework in place to make sure that when we have agreements, education agreements with nations or larger groups of Indigenous communities, that they work for Canadians, and that they work for those Indigenous communities. I think it's one of the things I wanted to make sure some people that don't understand, and I hear this often, that how can a First Nation be a nation? And I think what Indigenous people and First Nation people in the communities will say is that a First Nation, a reserve, is not a nation. It's the Anishinaabe Nation. So it's many different communities, many different reserves make up that nation. It's a cultural, linguistic group. It's a regional group. It's like I was explaining before, where we have Spain and we have Denmark, we have Finland. It's those countries are made up of a linguistic, culturally unique people, and their boundaries, if you look at a map of Europe, are boundaries that are geographical. They're waterways, they're mountain ranges. The boundaries are not straight lines, whereas we have here in Canada straight lines for boundaries of the provinces. But that's the boundaries of the nations that were here before colonization were large and were irregular. If you look in BC, there's many nations there because of the mountain ranges and a lot of the geographical boundaries between the nations. And if you get on the plains, there's more the larger nations, larger geographically, because there was less boundaries. So we have the Cree right across the north, but the Cree are distinct in parts of the north. We have the Swampy Cree in northern Manitoba that are different from the James Bay Cree, that the Anishinaabe, who are different than the Algonquins in southern Ontario and Quebec. So a lot of education still needs to be done for your everyday Canadian, and I think we need to start doing that in the school. But you asked what just your everyday Canadian can do. You and I think, educate ourselves and go out and start talking to people. So one of the big responsibilities and challenges of governments is to balance divergent interests and thoughts. And so a couple of the people who I've talked to in advance of the show have kind of posed questions. And both of them are balancing economic growth and jobs with the interests of people that live in those areas, whether it's a pipeline, the Kinder Morgan pipeline going to Vancouver, whether it's the Ring of Fire here, and you've got local groups, some are Indigenous and some aren't, who are saying, no, we don't want it in our backyard.
how do you see your role, or as government's role, in balancing those divergent ideas, or should we just go for the jobs and regardless, or what?
No, I don't think that's the answer. I have been speaking to my BC colleagues about pipeline issues and divergent issues within communities. You can see right here in Northern Ontario, small communities where they don't have all the same. They don't think all the same.
Right.
So some want development no matter at any cost, and some want no development at any cost. You do have to balance the interest, right? Because we do live in a modern economy, but we want to make sure we have this planet because it's the only planet we have, and making sure it's protected. So doing it, I think doing it and balancing it, yeah, it is our job as the federal government.
We're out of time, Don. Thank you so much for coming on this show, and want to encourage folks to give us feedback on our Facebook page, Community Conversations. Stay safe and see you next week.
And we'll have to come back.
Yes, next week.